280 BC, the morning sun broke over the Pyrrhus River in southern Italy, illuminating a sight that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Across the river valley, positioned in the centre of King Pyrrhus's battle line, stood 20 creatures that no Roman soldier had ever seen before. Massive grey beasts, each standing over 10 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing more than 4 tons, covered in armour and carrying wooden towers filled with armed men, war elephants. To the 35,000 Roman legionaries assembled under Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus, these animals represented something beyond their comprehension. Rome had conquered Italy through discipline, organisation, and the systematic application of heavy infantry tactics perfected over centuries. The legion was the ultimate expression of military science, an unstoppable machine that had crushed Samnites, Etruscans, and Gauls through sheer tactical superiority. Now, they faced an enemy that rendered their tactical doctrine obsolete. The elephants weren't just animals, they were living siege engines, mobile fortresses that could shatter shield walls and trample formations into bloody paste. More terrifyingly, they induced complete psychological collapse in soldiers and horses that had never encountered anything like them. The Romans had no word for elephant in their vocabulary. They called them Lucanian oxen, after the region where they first appeared, a name that utterly failed to capture the reality of these beasts. What the Romans didn't know, standing in formation that morning, was that they were about to receive a masterclass in combined arms warfare from one of history's greatest tactical minds. King Pyrrhus of Epirus was no ordinary general. At 38 years old, he was considered the finest military commander alive, a student of the Macedonian system who had studied under veterans of Alexander the Great's campaigns. He had integrated elephants, purchased and captured from successor kingdoms in the east, into a sophisticated tactical system that used them as shock weapons to break enemy formations at critical moments. The Battle of Heraclea was about to demonstrate that Roman military supremacy had limits. More significantly, it would introduce psychological warfare on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. The terror induced by elephants would prove almost as important as their physical capabilities. This is the story of how giant animals from distant lands nearly destroyed Rome's Italian hegemony, and how the Romans, through characteristic stubbornness and adaptability, eventually learned to counter a weapon they had never imagined existed. To understand the shock of elephants in Italy, we need to understand what Rome was in 280 BC. The Roman Republic had spent the previous century conquering the Italian peninsula through relentless warfare. The legion, organised into maniples of 120 men, was the most advanced infantry system in the Western Mediterranean. Roman soldiers trained constantly in formation drill, weapons handling, and unit cohesion. They weren't conscripts, they were property-owning citizens with a vested interest in Rome's success. The Roman military system was built on predictability. Soldiers knew their role. Officers understood tactics. Every battle followed established patterns. Heavy infantry engaged heavy infantry. Cavalry screened flanks and pursued routing enemies. Light troops skirmished. Victory went to the side with better discipline, training, and leadership. This system had proven itself again and again against Italian opponents who fought in similar styles. When Rome interfered in a dispute between Tarentum and Thurii, 2 Greek cities in southern Italy, they expected another routine campaign of intimidation and conquest. Tarentum, panicking at Roman intervention, did something desperate. They called for help from Pyrrhus of Epirus, offering him money, supplies, and the promise of leading a coalition of Greek cities and Italian tribes against Rome. Pyrrhus, always looking for military glory and viewing himself as a new Alexander, accepted. He arrived in Italy in 280 BC with 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 20 war elephants. The Romans had intelligence reports about Pyrrhus's army. They knew he commanded Greek phalanx troops, elite heavy infantry armed with 18-foot sarissas, the long pikes that had conquered Persia under Alexander. They knew about his cavalry, trained in the Thessalian tradition. They knew he brought siege equipment and engineers. What they didn't fully comprehend was the elephants. Roman scouts had seen the beast during their march from Tarentum. The reports seemed incredible. Animals larger than any ox, with long, flexible noses they used like arms, tusks of ivory longer than a man's leg, and skin so thick that javelins reportedly bounced off. The Senate heard these reports with skepticism. Some senators thought the scouts were exaggerating, or had been fooled by some Greek trickery, Others thought the animals might be large but surely couldn't be militarily significant. Experienced Roman commanders assured the Senate that discipline and training would overcome any animal, no matter how exotic. Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus, commanding the Roman army, was confident as he marched south to confront Pyrrhus. He had fought Samnites, tough mountain warriors who knew the Italian terrain. He had experience with cavalry charges, ambushes, and fighting in difficult terrain. He believed Roman discipline and the legion's tactical flexibility would prove decisive. On the morning of the battle, the armies deployed on opposite sides of the Siri River near Heraclea. The Romans formed their traditional triple line, Hastati in front, Princeps in the second line, Triarii in reserve. Each maniple maintained spacing for tactical flexibility. Light troops, velites, screened the front. Roman cavalry, never Rome's strongest arm with only about 2,000 horses, covered the flanks. Across the river, Pyrrhus deployed his phalanx in the Macedonian style. The phalanx was an entirely different tactical concept from the legion. Where Roman maniples could maneuver independently, the phalanx was a single massive block of men shoulder to shoulder, presenting a wall of pike points that could be 16 ranks deep. The sarissa, held with both hands, created an impenetrable hedge of iron that could push through almost any infantry formation through sheer momentum and the psychological pressure of advancing pike points. Behind the phalanx, Pyrrhus positioned his cavalry on both flanks, significantly outnumbering Roman horse. Greek cavalry, particularly Thessalian cavalry, was among the finest in the ancient world, far superior to Roman horsemen who were primarily aristocrats with limited training. And in the centre, positioned to support the phalanx, stood the elephants. 20 Indian elephants, each standing between 9 and 11 feet at the shoulder. Each elephant carried a mahout, a driver trained from childhood to control the animal, and a small tower holding 3 or 4 soldiers armed with javelins and arrows. The elephants themselves wore armour, leather or cloth coverings that protected their flanks and heads, and their tusks were tipped with bronze blades. Pyrrhus had trained his entire army to work with elephants. The phalanx knew not to react when elephants passed through their ranks. The cavalry was accustomed to their smell and sound. The light infantry knew how to use elephants as mobile cover, following behind them to shoot at enemies from relative safety. This wasn't improvised battlefield innovation. This was a refined tactical system developed over decades in the Hellenistic kingdoms. The battle opened with a cavalry engagement on the Roman right flank. Roman horsemen, outnumbered and outclassed, fought bravely, but were steadily pushed back by Greek cavalry. On the Roman left, the situation was similar. Greek horsemen, better trained and better mounted, began to envelop the Roman flank. This was concerning but not catastrophic. Roman infantry doctrine emphasized the centre. If the legions could break the Greek phalanx, the cavalry situation would resolve itself. The Romans began their advance. Hastati in front, throwing their pila, heavy javelins that could pierce shields and armour. The javelins had limited effect against the phalanx's deep formation and long pikes. The Roman infantry then drew swords and charged. This was the moment that had decided 100 Italian battles. Roman gladius, short stabbing swords, were devastating in close combat. Roman training emphasized individual combat skill. Each legionary was a trained killer who could fight effectively in loose or tight formation. But the phalanx didn't break. The wall of pike points, each sarissa extending 18 feet, kept the Romans at distance. Roman soldiers tried to grab the pike shafts, tried to cut them, tried to slip between them. Some succeeded, but the phalanx was 16 ranks deep. Even if the front rank fell, there were 15 more ranks behind them. The Romans pushed forward with characteristic determination, taking casualties but gaining ground through sheer aggression and willingness to accept losses. The phalanx began to give ground slowly, its formation compressing under Roman pressure. This was exactly the moment Pyrrhus had been waiting for. He had studied Roman tactics from Greek city-states that had fought Rome. He knew Romans would commit fully to breaking the phalanx centre, believing their infantry superior. He knew they would push hard, accepting casualties to achieve breakthrough, and he knew the exact moment when committed infantry, pushing forward with all their strength, would be most vulnerable to shock. Pyrrhus gave the signal. The elephants advanced. 20 war elephants, moving at a walk, emerged from behind the phalanx. The mahouts urged them forward with commands and pressure from their feet. The soldiers in the towers readied their javelins. The ground shook. This wasn't metaphor. 4 tons of elephant create seismic impact with each step. 20 elephants advancing in formation produced a rumble that soldiers felt through their feet before they understood what was happening. Then the Romans saw them. Frontline soldiers, engaged with the phalanx, heard trumpeting that didn't sound like any military signal they knew. They glanced up and saw massive grey shapes moving toward them. The reaction was instant and catastrophic. Roman discipline, the foundation of legionary effectiveness, evaporated. Soldiers in the front ranks tried to back away, pushing into the ranks behind them. Officers shouted commands that were drowned out by elephant trumpeting and screaming men. The neat maniple formation, Rome's tactical advantage, dissolved into a crowd of panicking individuals. The elephants hit the Roman line like mobile earthquakes. A charging elephant is effectively unstoppable by infantry. At 4 tons, moving at perhaps 15 miles per hour, an elephant has momentum that no shield wall can resist. The first Roman soldiers to face the charge tried to hold formation. They were crushed, thrown aside, or simply trampled. An elephant's foot is roughly 16 inches in diameter. A single step can crush a human torso. The soldiers in the towers threw javelins down into the packed Roman formation. At close range, these missiles were deadly accurate, killing men who were too crowded to dodge. But the physical casualties, horrific as they were, weren't the primary effect. The psychological impact was absolute. Roman soldiers had trained for combat against humans. They understood swords, spears, and arrows. They could process those threats and react appropriately. An elephant was beyond their frame of reference. It was too large, too alien, too overwhelming. Modern military psychology recognizes this phenomenon. When soldiers face a threat they cannot process, they don't fight effectively, they panic. The Romans in 280 BC experienced complete cognitive overload. Some soldiers tried to fight the elephants. They threw javelins that bounced off thick hide or stuck without penetrating deeply enough to seriously wound. They stabbed with swords that couldn't reach vital organs through layers of elephant flesh and muscle. A few brave or foolish men tried to hamstring the beasts, getting close enough to slash at legs, only to be killed by defensive kicks or grabbed by trunks and thrown. The trunks were perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect. An elephant's trunk, controlled by over 40,000 muscles, can lift 600 pounds and manipulate objects with incredible precision. Elephants in combat use their trunks as weapons, grabbing soldiers, throwing them into the air or simply crushing them. Soldiers watching their comrades picked up like children's toys and hurled away experienced terror on a primal level that overrode all training. The Roman cavalry situation was even worse. Horses, unlike humans, rely heavily on smell for threat assessment. The scent of elephant was completely foreign and triggered instinctive panic responses. Roman cavalry horses, already hard-pressed by superior Greek horsemen, caught the elephant scent and went berserk. Horses reared, threw their riders, or bolted from the battlefield entirely. Officers lost control of their mounts, formations disintegrated. The Roman cavalry effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force within minutes of elephant deployment. On the Roman left flank, cavalry fleeing from elephants rode directly into their own infantry, creating chaos and spreading panic. On the right, horses trampled through the velites, light infantry, who scattered to avoid being crushed by their own cavalry. Pyrrhus, watching from his command position, saw the Roman formation crumbling and committed his cavalry to exploitation. Greek horsemen, their own mounts trained to tolerate elephant smell, charged into the disordered Roman flanks. This was cavalry warfare at its most devastating, horsemen stabbing down at infantry who couldn't form defensive walls, who were isolated and vulnerable. The Roman casualties mounted catastrophically. In the centre, the elephants pushed deeper into the Roman formation, the phalanx following behind them. The Sarissa wall, which had been slowly giving ground, now advanced over Roman bodies. The pike points stabbed down at wounded men, finished off anyone who moved. The combination of elephant shock and phalanx discipline created a killing machine that the Roman legion couldn't counter. Consul Laevinus tried to rally his men. Roman officers, screaming themselves hoarse, attempted to reform units around the standards. Some maniples not yet engaged with elephants maintained cohesion. The Triarii, the veteran third line who had seen the disaster unfold, held formation and began an organised fighting withdrawal. But the battle was lost. Roman infantry, the the foundation of Rome's military power, had been shattered by animals they didn't understand and couldn't effectively fight. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers threw away shields and weapons to run faster. Officers were abandoned by their men. The Triarii covered the withdrawal, fighting steady delaying actions that prevented complete annihilation, but the Roman army was broken. Pyrrhus pursued with cavalry and light infantry, but didn't commit his elephants to the chase. The beasts were too valuable to risk in the confusion of pursuit, and the mahouts knew that overexertion could injure or kill an elephant worth more than a year's military budget. The casualties from Heraclea are disputed in ancient sources, but most reliable accounts suggest Rome lost between 7,000 and 15,000 men killed, with thousands more wounded. Pyrrhus lost perhaps 4,000 men, including some of his best officers. It was the officer losses that led Pyrrhus to make his famous comment about Pyrrhic victories, but from the Roman perspective, the loss was catastrophic. Rome had suffered defeats before. Gauls had sacked the city a century earlier, but those defeats were understood within Roman military frameworks. Heraclea was different. Roman soldiers had been routed by animals, their courage and discipline meaningless against threats they couldn't comprehend. The psychological impact extended far beyond the casualties. When survivors reached Rome and described the battle, citizens struggled to believe the accounts. Elephants that could crush soldiers like insects, that grabbed men with their noses and threw them, that couldn't be killed with swords or javelins. It sounded like mythology, like the monsters that heroes fought in Greek legends. But the evidence was undeniable. Thousands of dead, a consul returning in defeat, and the knowledge that Pyrrhus was advancing toward Rome with his invincible beasts. The Roman Senate faced a crisis unlike any in their history. They couldn't simply raise another army and expect different results. The tactical problem of elephants required a solution, and Rome had no experience to draw on. Some senators argued for negotiating peace with Pyrrhus, others insisted that Roman courage would prevail if they just fought harder. A few practical minds suggested that they needed to study the enemy, learn about elephants, and develop countermeasures. The Senate sent envoys to Greek cities that had experience with elephants. They questioned traders who had seen war elephants in the East. They consulted with anyone who might have knowledge about how to fight these creatures. What they learned was both reassuring and concerning. Elephants were mortal. They could be killed, though it required heavy weapons and concentrated fire. Elephants could panic. Loud noises, fire, and unexpected attacks could turn them from weapons into liabilities. If an elephant panicked, it might run through its own forces. Elephants were slow to turn and had blind spots directly in front and behind them. Agile troops could potentially exploit these vulnerabilities. But elephants in trained hands, commanded by experienced mahouts and supported by combined arms, were incredibly difficult to counter without specialized tactics. Rome began preparing countermeasures. They modified their pila, heavy javelins, to be longer and heavier, hoping to achieve deeper penetration. They trained soldiers to target elephant eyes and trunks, the most vulnerable areas. They experimented with fire weapons, though ancient incendiary technology was primitive and often as dangerous to the user as the target. Most importantly, they worked on soldier psychology. Officers gave speeches describing elephants as just large animals, no different from oxen except in size. They emphasized that elephants could be hurt, could be frightened, could be defeated. Some units trained with cattle to desensitize soldiers to large animals, though a cow bears about as much resemblance to a war elephant as a house cat does to a lion. While Rome prepared, Pyrrhus consolidated his position in southern Italy. Greek cities allied with him. Some Italian tribes, seeing Rome defeated, switched sides. Pyrrhus treated his Italian allies well, positioning himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He sent embassies to Rome offering generous peace terms. Pyrrhus's envoy Cineas was a skilled diplomat who understood Roman politics. He offered Rome recognition of Greek independence in southern Italy, which Rome might have accepted before Heraclea. Now the Senate was divided. The pro-peace faction argued that continuing the war risked more devastating defeats. Rome couldn't match Pyrrhus's military expertise or his elephants. Better to accept honourable terms and avoid further bloodshed. The war faction, led by old Appius Claudius Caecus, argued that accepting defeat would end Roman expansion and make Rome look weak to every Italian tribe they had conquered. Appius Claudius was blind and officially retired, but he had himself carried into the Senate to deliver a speech that became legendary in Roman history. He argued that Rome had never been defeated permanently, that Roman virtue and determination would overcome any obstacle, that accepting Pyrrhus's terms meant surrendering Italy to a foreign king. His speech carried the day. The Senate rejected peace terms and began raising new legions. The decision meant continued war, but it also demonstrated something fundamental about Roman strategic culture. Rome didn't accept defeat. They learned, adapted, and returned stronger. This pattern, more than any tactical innovation, would eventually defeat Pyrrhus and his elephants. In 279 BC, a year after Heraclea, Rome fielded a new army under consul Publius Decius Mus, son of a famous consul who had died in battle against the Gauls. Decius Mus had 40,000 legionaries, larger than the army at Heraclea, and they had received the new training and equipment designed to counter elephants. The two armies met at Asculum in Apulia. Pyrrhus chose the battlefield carefully, looking for terrain that would negate some Roman advantages. He selected ground crossed by a river with wooded areas that would restrict Roman maneuverability. The first day of battle was largely indecisive. The Roman legions, fighting in terrain that favoured infantry combat, held their own against the phalanx. The new anti-elephant tactics proved partially effective. When Pyrrhus deployed his elephants, Roman soldiers didn't panic as completely as at Heraclea. They maintained better formation discipline, fell back in organised fashion, and some units successfully targeted the towers on the elephants' backs with heavy javelins. But elephants in good terrain, supported properly, remained devastatingly effective. Roman soldiers might not panic and flee, but they still couldn't hold ground against a 4-ton animal. The elephants pushed back Roman advances, disrupted formations, and created opportunities for the phalanx to exploit. On the second day, Pyrrhus made adjustments. He deployed his elephants more aggressively, using them as mobile strongpoints that the phalanx could advance behind. He mixed light infantry with the elephants, soldiers whose job was to protect the beast from Roman attempts to disable or kill them. The battle became a grinding attritional struggle. Roman legions pushed forward with characteristic determination, accepting horrific casualties to try to break the phalanx. The phalanx, supported by elephants, held firm and counterattacked when Romans overextended. The cavalry battle on the flanks was fierce, with neither side gaining decisive advantage. By late afternoon, both armies were exhausted. Casualties were tremendous on both sides, but the Romans broke first, not in panic flight like Heraclea, but in organised withdrawal. Consul Decius Mus recognised that continuing the battle would lead to complete destruction of his army. He pulled back in good order, the triarii covering the retreat. Pyrrhus had won again, but the cost was staggering. Ancient sources suggest he lost nearly 4,000 men, including many irreplaceable officers and experienced soldiers. His elephants had taken casualties, some killed by concentrated Roman javelin fire, others wounded and requiring long recovery. It was after Asculum that Pyrrhus reportedly made his famous comment, "One more such victory and I shall be utterly ruined." Whether he actually said this is debatable, but the sentiment was accurate. Pyrrhus was winning battles but losing the war. His army couldn't be easily replaced. Dead elephants couldn't be replaced at all. There was no source of new war elephants in Italy, or even in Greece. Rome, conversely, could raise new legions indefinitely. Their manpower reserves from Italian allies dwarfed anything Pyrrhus could access. Every battle, even a victory, weakened Pyrrhus while Rome could absorb the losses and return stronger. More significantly, Roman soldiers were learning. They had now faced elephants twice. The mystery was gone, replaced by hard-earned tactical knowledge. Elephants were dangerous but not invincible. They could be hurt. They had vulnerabilities. Most importantly, they could be managed through proper tactical approach. The Roman learning process would continue, but Pyrrhus made a strategic mistake that would ultimately seal his fate in Italy. He accepted an invitation from Greek cities in Sicily to help them fight Carthage, leaving Italy for what he thought would be a quick, profitable campaign. The Sicilian adventure lasted from 278 to 275 BC. Pyrrhus won battles, captured cities, and nearly drove Carthage off the island. But he also exhausted his army, lost more irreplaceable veterans, and crucially gave Rome 3 years to prepare. When Pyrrhus returned to Italy in 275 BC, he found a very different situation. Rome had rebuilt its armies, refined its anti-elephant tactics, and more importantly, the psychological terror of elephants had faded. Roman soldiers had 3 years to absorb the reality that elephants, while dangerous, could be defeated. Veterans who had survived Heraclea and Asculum trained new recruits, passing on hard-won tactical knowledge. The climactic battle occurred at Beneventum in 275 BC. The Roman army, commanded by consul Manius Curius Dentatus, deployed on ground they had chosen, hills that would make elephant movement difficult. Dentatus, learning from previous battles, positioned his army with careful attention to terrain features that would channel elephant attacks. The battle opened with Pyrrhus deploying his elephants early, hoping to break the Roman line quickly and decisively. He had perhaps a dozen elephants left, the rest killed or too injured for combat. These remaining beasts represented his last significant tactical advantage. The elephants advanced up the slopes toward the Roman position. The mahouts urged them forward, but elephants climbing steep terrain move slowly and are vulnerable. Roman light troops, velites specially trained in anti-elephant tactics, swarmed around the beasts. They didn't attack the elephants directly. Instead, they threw javelins at the soldiers in the towers, killing or wounding the men who provided fire support. They targeted the mahouts, the drivers whose death or injury left elephants uncontrolled. Most significantly, they used fire. Roman soldiers had prepared bundles of flaming material, primitive incendiaries that they threw at the elephants. Ancient sources describe them using war wagons with extended spikes that they set on fire, though the reliability of these accounts is questionable. What's clear is that the Romans used fire as a psychological weapon against the elephants. Elephants, for all their size and strength, fear fire instinctively. The combination of flames, smoke, and pain from burns caused several elephants to panic. A panicked elephant is uncontrollable. It doesn't follow commands, it runs from perceived threat, which might mean running back through its own forces. At Beneventum, at least 2 elephants panicked and charged back into Pyrrhus's phalanx. A 4-ton animal running through a tightly packed infantry formation creates catastrophic casualties. Phalangites couldn't dodge, couldn't get out of the way quickly enough. The panicked elephants trampled through ranks of Greek infantry, killing dozens of men and creating gaps in the formation. Roman legions, seeing the phalanx disrupted, attacked immediately. This was the moment they had trained for, the opportunity to engage the phalanx when it wasn't in perfect formation. The maniples pushed forward, exploiting the gaps created by panicked elephants. The close-quarters combat that followed played to Roman strengths. The gladius was more effective than the sarissa when formations broke down. Roman training emphasized individual combat skill. Greek phalangites, trained to fight as part of a massive formation, struggled when isolated. The battle devolved into what Romans called a soldier's fight, small unit actions decided by training and courage rather than tactical brilliance. The Roman legions gradually pushed Pyrrhus's army back. The Greek cavalry, which had dominated at Heraclea and Asculum, couldn't effectively support the disrupted phalanx. Pyrrhus, recognizing that continuing the battle meant potential annihilation, withdrew from the field. Beneventum was not the crushing Roman victory that some sources claim. Casualties were probably roughly equal. Pyrrhus extricated most of his army and retreated in good order, but strategically, the battle was decisive. Pyrrhus had failed to win, and failure was the same as defeat in his strategic position. His Italian allies, seeing that he couldn't guarantee protection, began making separate peace with Rome. His army, depleted and exhausted, couldn't be reinforced. His elephants, the weapon that had terrorized Rome, had proven unreliable and vulnerable to prepared opponents. Pyrrhus left Italy in 275 BC, returning to Epirus with perhaps a third of the army he had brought 5 years earlier. He would die in 272 BC fighting in Greece, killed during street fighting in Argos, reportedly by a roof tile thrown by an old woman. His death was anticlimactic for one of the ancient world's finest generals. The Pyrrhic Wars had profound implications for Rome and for military history. Rome had faced the most sophisticated combined arms system in the ancient world and survived. More than survived, they had learned and adapted. The experience taught Rome valuable lessons about military flexibility and the importance of learning from defeat. The elephant threat hadn't been eliminated. Carthage would bring elephants to Italy again during the Second Punic War, but Romans had developed countermeasures and lost their psychological vulnerability to the beasts. The wars also established Rome's dominance in Italy. The Greek cities that had invited Pyrrhus now submitted to Roman authority. Italian tribes recognized that Rome couldn't be defeated even by the finest foreign general with weapons beyond Roman technology. Within a decade, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po Valley. But what were war elephants really? How effective were they compared to the near mythical status they held in ancient warfare? Modern military analysis suggests that elephants were powerful but specialized weapons with significant limitations. An elephant required years of training, massive amounts of food, experienced handlers, and couldn't operate effectively in all terrain or weather. Cold weather was particularly problematic. Elephants are tropical animals that suffer in freezing conditions. This would prove decisive in later conflicts, including Hannibal's use of elephants in the Alps. Elephants were most effective against enemies who had never encountered them, exactly Rome's situation in 280 BC. The psychological shock value declined rapidly as soldiers gained experience. By the time of Julius Caesar, elephants were still used occasionally, but were considered exotic rather than game-changing weapons. The tactical limitations were significant. Elephants couldn't take and hold ground. They couldn't fight effectively in forests, marshes, or mountainous terrain. They required significant logistical support, each elephant eating 300 to 400 pounds of food daily. An army with 20 elephants needed to find 6 to 8 tons of food for them daily, a massive burden on ancient supply systems. The risk of elephants panicking and attacking their own forces was ever present. Ancient sources describe multiple battles where panicked elephants caused more casualties to their own side than to the enemy. Mahouts carried hammers and chisels. Their job was to kill their own elephant by driving the chisel into its brain if it became uncontrollable, a brutal but necessary fail-safe. Despite these limitations, elephants remained in military use for centuries after Pyrrhus. The Seleucid Empire maintained large elephant corps. Indian kingdoms used elephants extensively. Even late Roman and Byzantine armies occasionally employed elephants, though more for psychological effect and logistics than as primary combat weapons. The real lesson of the Pyrrhic Wars wasn't about elephants specifically, it was about Rome's institutional ability to learn and adapt. Roman military culture valued practical results over theoretical purity. When faced with a weapon they couldn't counter, they didn't insist their traditional methods were superior, they studied the problem and developed solutions. This flexibility would serve Rome well in future conflicts. When Hannibal brought elephants across the Alps in 218 BC, Roman soldiers were concerned but not terrified. They had institutional knowledge about elephant countermeasures passed down from the Pyrrhic Wars. When Rome encountered Macedonian phalanxes again in the 2nd century BC, they knew how to exploit phalanx weaknesses that they had learned fighting Pyrrhus. The wars also demonstrated limits of tactical brilliance. Pyrrhus was arguably a better general than any Roman commander he faced. His tactical innovations and use of combined arms were more sophisticated than Roman methods. But strategy trumped tactics. Rome's ability to absorb defeats, raise new armies, and continue fighting outlasted Pyrrhus's tactical genius. The human element of these wars deserves recognition. Roman soldiers at Heraclea faced terror beyond anything in their experience. They broke and fled not from cowardice, but from complete psychological overload. That they returned to face elephants again at Asculum demonstrates extraordinary courage. That they eventually developed countermeasures shows remarkable institutional resilience. For the Greek and Italian soldiers fighting under Pyrrhus, the wars were equally traumatic. They watched Roman legions absorb catastrophic casualties and keep coming. They saw their king win battle after battle without achieving strategic victory. They experienced the slow realization that fighting Rome meant facing inexhaustible manpower reserves. The elephant handlers, mahouts who had trained for years with their animals, faced their own psychological challenges. They were responsible for controlling 4-ton weapons that could turn on friendly forces. The pressure of knowing that losing control meant killing your own comrades must have been immense. The logistics of the Pyrrhic Wars were staggering. Pyrrhus had to transport elephants by ship from Epirus to Italy, a dangerous voyage even in good weather. He needed to establish supply lines to feed his army and his elephants in hostile territory. He needed to recruit local allies while keeping his own troops disciplined and motivated. Rome faced different challenges. They needed to raise legion after legion, equipping tens of thousands of men with arms and armour. They needed to maintain political cohesion when defeats threatened to break their alliance system. They needed to convince citizens and allies that continuing the war was worthwhile despite mounting casualties. The economic impact was significant for both sides. Pyrrhus bankrupted himself funding the Italian campaign. His kingdom of Epirus never recovered from the expense. Rome incurred massive debts financing the wars, but their larger economic base could absorb the cost more easily. The wars accelerated Rome's transformation from a regional Italian power to a Mediterranean great power. Victory over Pyrrhus demonstrated that Rome could defeat the finest generals and most sophisticated armies. Within 50 years, Rome would be fighting Carthage for control of the western Mediterranean. Within a century, Rome would conquer the Hellenistic kingdoms that had produced the military system Pyrrhus used. The cultural exchange was equally significant. Rome absorbed Greek military innovations, incorporating phalanx elements where useful, while maintaining legionary flexibility. Roman engineering improved through exposure to Greek siege techniques. Roman naval tactics borrowed from Greek experience. This pattern of learning from enemies would characterize Roman expansion. They weren't culturally or intellectually arrogant. If an enemy had superior weapons, tactics, or techniques, Rome studied and incorporated them. The elephant itself became a symbol in Roman culture. Elephants appeared in triumphal processions, showing Roman audiences the exotic weapons they had defeated. Elephants performed in games and spectacles. The Latin word for elephant, elephantus, entered the language as a symbol of massive size and unstoppable power. Modern military historians debate whether the Pyrrhic Wars represented a clash between Western and Eastern military systems. Pyrrhus used Hellenistic combined arms tactics developed in successor kingdoms after Alexander. Rome used Italian heavy infantry tactics developed through centuries of peninsular warfare. The wars showed that neither system was inherently superior. Success depended on circumstance, terrain, and leadership. The individual battles of the Pyrrhic Wars were studied by military theorists for centuries. Heraclea became a case study in shock tactics and psychological warfare. Asculum demonstrated the importance of terrain in battle planning. Beneventum showed how prepared forces could neutralize supposedly invincible weapons. Ancient military writers, including Polybius and later Roman historians, analyzed the wars to extract lessons for future generals. The questions they asked remain relevant. How do you counter weapons you've never encountered? How do you maintain morale after devastating defeats? How do you balance tactical innovation with strategic consistency? The legacy of the Pyrrhic Wars extended beyond military history. The term Pyrrhic victory entered language as shorthand for wins so costly they're effectively defeats. This concept, that victory must be evaluated not just by battlefield results, but by long-term strategic impact, influenced military thinking for millennia. The wars also established patterns for Roman expansion. Rome learned that they couldn't assume tactical superiority against all enemies. They needed intelligence gathering, tactical flexibility, and willingness to learn from defeats. These lessons served Rome well in later conflicts against Carthage, Macedon, and eventually in civil wars between Roman generals. For modern readers, the Pyrrhic Wars offer insights into military adaptation and the relationship between tactical and strategic success. Pyrrhus won almost every battle but lost the war. Rome lost most battles but achieved strategic objectives. This paradox reveals fundamental truths about warfare that remain relevant today. The human drama of the wars shouldn't be lost in tactical analysis. Roman soldiers facing elephants for the first time experienced genuine terror. Survivors carried psychological scars. Families mourned sons, fathers, and brothers killed by exotic weapons in distant battles. Greek and Italian soldiers fighting for Pyrrhus believed they were defending their homes against Roman imperialism. They fought bravely for a cause they thought just. When Pyrrhus left Italy, many of his Italian allies felt abandoned and betrayed. The elephant handlers who brought their charges across the Mediterranean faced constant pressure to perform. When elephants panicked at Beneventum, mahouts died trying to control them, or were killed by their own side for failing to maintain control. The political drama in Rome during the wars shaped Roman history. The Senate debates over whether to continue fighting or accept peace revealed fundamental divisions about Rome's role in Italy and the Mediterranean. The decision to reject Pyrrhus's terms, made at enormous human and economic cost, committed Rome to a path of expansion that would eventually create an empire. The wars occurred at a pivotal moment in Mediterranean history. The Hellenistic kingdoms were still powerful but beginning to decline. Carthage dominated Western Mediterranean trade. Rome was emerging as a major power but hadn't yet challenged Carthage or the Eastern kingdoms. The Pyrrhic Wars marked Rome's first major conflict with Hellenistic military systems. The outcome, Roman victory despite inferior tactics and weaponry, signalled that the future belonged to Rome's strategic endurance rather than Greek tactical brilliance. In 272 BC, 2 years after Pyrrhus left Italy and the year of his death, Rome completed its conquest of southern Italy. The Greek cities that had invited Pyrrhus now accepted Roman alliance on Rome's terms. Tarentum, which had started the war by calling for Pyrrhus's help, surrendered to Rome. The elephants that had terrorized Roman legions were gone, dead in battle, dead from disease or exhaustion, or taken back to Epirus with Pyrrhus's depleted army. Roman veterans who had faced the great beast told stories that became legends. Young soldiers listened to accounts of creatures that grabbed men with their noses, that crushed soldiers beneath massive feet, that trumpeted like thunder. These stories would pass into Roman military culture, shaping how future generations approached warfare. The practical lessons shaped Roman military development. Anti-elephant tactics became part of standard training. Roman armies developed specialized units and weapons for dealing with exotic threats. The institutional knowledge gained fighting Pyrrhus would prove invaluable in later wars, but perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. Rome had faced a supposedly invincible weapon wielded by one of history's greatest generals, and prevailed. This victory reinforced Roman belief in their military superiority and destiny to rule. It gave them confidence to challenge Carthage and eventually conquer the Mediterranean world. The Pyrrhic Wars represented a turning point in ancient military history. Traditional Hellenistic warfare, exemplified by Pyrrhus's sophisticated combined arms tactics and use of elephants, met Roman attrition warfare and industrial-scale military production. The old world of brilliant generals commanding relatively small professional armies gave way to Rome's system of large citizen armies that could be raised repeatedly regardless of losses. The wars also marked the end of elephants as truly game-changing weapons. After Pyrrhus, no general would achieve the same level of psychological terror using elephants. Future opponents came prepared with countermeasures and psychological conditioning. Elephants remained in use for centuries, but more as symbols of exotic power than as decisive battlefield weapons. For Pyrrhus himself, the Italian campaign was a tragic failure. He had sought glory comparable to Alexander the Great, but instead exhausted his kingdom and army in an unwinnable war. His brilliance as a tactical commander couldn't overcome the strategic reality that Rome's resources and determination made them unbeatable in a war of attrition. The old saying about Pyrrhic victories captures his tragedy perfectly. He won battles but lost everything meaningful. For Rome, the wars were a costly but valuable learning experience. The defeats at Heraclea and Asculum taught humility and the need for tactical flexibility. The strategic victory taught that persistence and adaptability could overcome tactical disadvantages. These lessons would serve Rome well for centuries. In the end, the story of war elephants in Italy is about more than exotic animals and ancient battles. It's about how military forces adapt to unexpected threats, how psychological factors influence combat, how strategic endurance can overcome tactical brilliance, and how institutions that learn from defeat can ultimately triumph over enemies who win every battle. The Roman soldiers who fled in terror at Heraclea and the Roman soldiers who held their ground at Beneventum were separated by only 5 years and hard-won experience. In that transformation lay the key to Roman success, not superior weapons or tactics, but the ability to face defeat, learn, and return stronger. The thunder of elephants had terrified Roman legions, but Rome's response, determined adaptation, and relentless strategic pressure eventually silenced that thunder and established Roman dominance over Italy. The broader implications of elephant warfare extended far beyond Italy. The knowledge that Rome had developed effective countermeasures spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Other states facing elephant-equipped armies sought Roman advice or studied Roman tactics. The military treatises written in subsequent centuries incorporated anti-elephant doctrine based largely on Roman experience against Pyrrhus. The economic aspects of elephant warfare deserve deeper examination. A single war elephant represented an enormous investment, comparable to modern main battle tanks or combat aircraft. The initial acquisition cost was staggering. Indian elephants, the species used by Hellenistic armies, had to be captured in India or Ceylon, transported thousands of miles and delivered to military depots. The journey alone could take years and kill many animals. Training costs multiplied the expense. An elephant required at least 5 years of training to be combat ready. During this period, it consumed massive quantities of food while producing no military value. The mahout training was equally lengthy. Boys were assigned to elephants as children and spent years learning to control and communicate with their animal. The relationship between mahout and elephant was so close that losing one often meant losing both as military assets. Maintenance costs were continuous and substantial. Each elephant needed 300 to 400 pounds of food daily, preferably a varied diet including grains, fruits and vegetables to maintain health. In military campaigns far from supply bases, feeding elephants often proved impossible. Hannibal lost most of his elephants in Italy not to combat but to starvation and disease when he couldn't maintain adequate supply lines. The veterinary requirements were specialised and demanding. Elephants suffered from numerous ailments that could incapacitate them. Foot problems were especially common, as elephants' feet weren't adapted to long marches on hard surfaces. Infected feet could kill an elephant or render it permanently lame. Respiratory diseases spread easily through elephant units kept in close quarters. Without expert veterinary care, elephant corps quickly deteriorated. The infrastructure required to support elephants was extensive. Stables needed to be enormous, at least 20 feet high with reinforced walls. Elephants are intelligent and can become bored or agitated in captivity. Bored elephants destroy their enclosures or injure handlers. Special equipment was needed for feeding, bathing, and medical care. Transport ships had to be specially modified to carry elephants, with reinforced decks and enlarged holds. Given these enormous costs, why did ancient states continue using elephants for centuries? The answer lies in their unique capabilities when properly employed. An elephant could perform tasks that no other ancient military asset could match. They could break through fortifications that would stop any other weapon. They could create instant psychological effects that inspired friendly forces while demoralizing enemies. They served as mobile command posts, giving commanders elevated views of battlefields. In siege warfare, elephants proved especially valuable. They could push siege towers into position, break down gates with their tusks and trunks, and clear obstacles. During the siege of Megalopolis in 318 BC, elephants broke through walls that had resisted conventional siege equipment for months. In India, where elephants originated as military weapons, they remained central to siege warfare for over 1,000 years. The cultural significance of elephants in ancient warfare went beyond practical military considerations. Possession of elephants demonstrated wealth, power, and connections to distant lands. When rulers displayed elephants in parades or ceremonies, they were advertising their imperial reach and exotic resources. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt maintained large elephant corps partly for prestige, hunting African elephants to compete with Seleucid Indian elephants. The elephant corps became a branch of service with its own traditions, pride, and identity. Mahouts formed hereditary castes in some kingdoms, passing skills and knowledge from father to son. The elephant handlers developed their own culture, mythology, and social structures. In Indian kingdoms, the elephant corps often constituted a military aristocracy with significant political influence. The Romans, despite developing effective anti-elephant tactics, eventually incorporated elephants into their own military system. After defeating Carthage, Rome captured numerous elephants and used them in subsequent campaigns. Roman elephants appeared in Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and Britain, where the animals terrified Celtic warriors who had never seen them. The psychological weapon that had terrorized Roman legions was turned against Rome's enemies. The tactical evolution of anti-elephant warfare continued long after Pyrrhus. Roman military theorists developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. One approach involved using specially trained pigs covered in pitch and set alight. The flaming pigs would be driven toward elephants, their squealing and appearance supposedly frightening the larger animals. Whether this tactic was actually used or remained theoretical is debated, but its appearance in multiple sources suggests some practical basis. Another Roman innovation was the use of caltrops, metal spikes designed to injure elephant feet. Scattered across likely elephant approach routes, caltrops could lame elephants or force them into kill zones. The development of specialized bolt throwers, essentially heavy crossbows mounted on frames, gave Roman forces standoff weapons capable of penetrating elephant hide. These weapons could kill or wound elephants from beyond javelin range. The Romans also refined their use of terrain to neutralize elephants. They sought battlefields with forests, marshes, steep hills, or other obstacles that made elephant movement difficult. When forced to fight on elephant-favorable terrain, Romans dug ditches or built obstacles that channeled elephants into prepared killing zones, where concentrated missile fire could bring them down. The psychological conditioning of Roman soldiers improved dramatically. Veterans who had faced elephants were deliberately spread through new units to provide steady influence during combat. Officers gave detailed briefings describing elephant capabilities and vulnerabilities. Some units even trained against mock elephants, large wooden frames covered with hides and moved by men inside, to familiarize soldiers with elephant appearance and movement. The evolution of Roman anti-elephant doctrine culminated in the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC during Caesar's African campaign. Caesar's legions faced a Numidian army with 64 war elephants, a massive concentration of the animals. Caesar deployed his 5th Legion, veterans with extensive elephant experience, as specialists to counter the threat. The 5th Legion used javelins, slings, and archery to target the elephants while maintaining formation discipline. The elephants were driven back into their own forces, causing chaos that allowed Caesar's legions to achieve decisive victory. By the time of the Roman Empire, elephants had largely disappeared from Mediterranean warfare. The logistical challenges and enormous costs outweighed their military benefits against prepared opponents. The rise of more effective siege equipment, particularly torsion artillery, reduced elephants' utility in sieges. The professionalization of infantry and development of combined arms tactics that didn't rely on shock weapons made elephants redundant. However, elephants remained militarily significant in India, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa for centuries after they vanished from Mediterranean battlefields. In these regions, abundant elephant populations and traditional expertise in elephant warfare sustained their military use. Indian kingdoms employed elephant corps into the early modern period, only abandoning them when firearms made the large, slow-moving targets too vulnerable. The Battle of Panipat in 1526, where the Mughal Emperor Babur defeated Ibrahim Lodi's army, marked a turning point. Lodi fielded approximately 1,000 war elephants against Babur's matchlock-armed infantry and artillery. The elephants, terrified by gunfire and hit by artillery, panicked and trampled their own forces. This battle demonstrated that gunpowder weapons had definitively ended the era of elephant warfare. The legacy of ancient elephant warfare persisted in unexpected ways. Military theorists studying shock tactics and psychological warfare continued referencing elephants as examples of how unfamiliar weapons could create disproportionate effects. Napoleon reportedly studied accounts of Hannibal's elephants when planning his own use of psychological warfare. Modern military doctrine on dealing with unconventional threats draws lessons from ancient anti-elephant tactics. The Pyrrhic Wars specifically influenced Roman military culture in ways that lasted centuries. The experience taught Rome that no weapon was invincible, no enemy unbeatable, and adaptation was essential to success. These lessons shaped Roman approaches to later conflicts. When Rome encountered new threats like Parthian cataphracts, horse archers, or Germanic tribal tactics, they responded with the same pattern: initial defeats, intensive study, tactical adaptation, and eventual victory. The wars also reinforced Roman emphasis on infrastructure and logistics over tactical elegance. While Pyrrhus relied on sophisticated tactics and elite troops, Rome built roads, supply depots, and fortifications that enabled sustained campaigns. Roman engineering, already impressive in 280 BC, received additional emphasis after the Pyrrhic Wars demonstrated how logistics could determine strategic outcomes. The political impact in Rome was equally significant. The Senate's decision to continue fighting despite defeat strengthened the war party's influence in Roman politics. The tradition of refusing to negotiate after defeats became embedded in Roman political culture. This stubbornness would characterize Roman responses to later crises, most famously in the Punic Wars when Rome refused peace terms after Cannae despite catastrophic losses. The Pyrrhic Wars established Rome's reputation for resilience that shaped diplomatic calculations throughout the ancient world. Other states recognized that Rome would accept enormous casualties rather than admit defeat. This reputation became a strategic asset. deterring some potential enemies while convincing allies that Roman commitments were reliable. For the Greek world, Pyrrhus's failure in Italy marked a symbolic transition. The era of Greek military dominance established by Alexander's conquests was ending. The future belonged to Rome's systematized warfare and vast manpower reserves rather than Greek tactical brilliance. The finest Greek general of his generation had been defeated not through superior tactics, but through strategic exhaustion. The Italian tribes and cities that had supported Pyrrhus faced harsh consequences. Rome's conquest of southern Italy after the wars was more thorough than previous Roman expansions. The cities that had invited foreign intervention were garrisoned, their walls torn down, their population sometimes enslaved or relocated. Rome ensured that southern Italy would never again serve as a base for foreign armies challenging Roman power. The treatment of defeated enemies established patterns that Rome would follow throughout its expansion. Rebellious communities faced destruction, while those that submitted peacefully received relatively generous terms. This combination of ruthlessness and pragmatism proved effective in building Rome's Italian confederacy. The lesson was clear: oppose Rome and face annihilation, submit and join a profitable alliance. The military reforms that followed the Pyrrhic Wars modernized the Roman legion. The Romans had recognized that while their basic tactical system was sound, it needed refinement. The manipular legion was already more flexible than the phalanx, but encounters with Pyrrhus revealed areas for improvement. The reforms focused on improving unit cohesion, refining command structures, and standardizing equipment. The experience of fighting Pyrrhus's combined arms force convinced Rome to improve its own cavalry. Roman cavalry had been decisively outmatched by Greek horsemen in every battle. Rome responded by recruiting cavalry from allied Italian tribes with stronger equestrian traditions, particularly the Campanians and Apulians. By the time of the Punic Wars, Roman allied cavalry had improved significantly, though Roman citizens themselves remained mediocre horsemen. The wars accelerated Rome's development of naval power. Pyrrhus's ability to transport his army from Epirus to Italy, and later to Sicily, demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling the sea. Rome had traditionally been a land power, but the Pyrrhic Wars showed that Mediterranean dominance required naval capabilities. Within a decade of the war's end, Rome was building the fleet that would challenge Carthage for control of the western Mediterranean. The strategic lessons Rome learned about resource management and sustained warfare proved crucial in later conflicts. Against Carthage, Rome would lose entire armies and fleets yet continue fighting. Against Macedonia, Rome would campaign repeatedly across the Adriatic until achieving decisive victory. Against Celtic invasions, Rome would absorb initial defeats then systematically conquer Gaul. The pattern established against Pyrrhus: accept defeats, adapt, and outlast enemies through superior resources and determination became the foundation of Roman grand strategy. The Pyrrhic Wars also influenced Roman colonization policy. After the wars, Rome accelerated its program of establishing colonies throughout Italy. These colonies served as garrisons, ensuring military control, but also as population centres that spread Roman culture. The colonial network established after the Pyrrhic Wars became the foundation for Rome's control of Italy, creating loyalty through shared economic interests rather than just military domination. The cultural exchange between Rome and the Greek world accelerated after the wars. Roman elites, impressed by Greek culture despite defeating Greek armies, increasingly adopted Greek learning, philosophy, and art. Pyrrhus himself, though a military enemy, was respected in Rome as an example of classical virtue and martial excellence. His famous comment about one more victory became a Roman proverb, used to teach strategic thinking to future generals. The military literature produced in the centuries following the Pyrrhic Wars extensively analysed the campaigns. Greek historians like Polybius dissected Pyrrhus's tactics and Rome's responses, using the wars as case studies in strategic thinking. Roman military manuals incorporated anti-elephant doctrine developed during the conflicts. Medieval and Renaissance military theorists studied the wars when analysing how to counter unconventional weapons. The archaeological evidence from the Pyrrhic Wars is limited but revealing. Mass graves from the battles show the horrific casualties on both sides. Analysis of skeletal remains indicates that many Roman soldiers died from crushing injuries consistent with being trampled by large animals. The grave goods buried with soldiers include amulets and offerings that some scholars interpret as magical protection against elephants. suggesting the psychological impact of the animals extended to religious practices. Numismatic evidence shows elephants appearing on coins from various Mediterranean states after the wars, indicating the cultural fascination with these animals. Some coins show elephants with warriors in towers, commemorating victories. Others show elephants being led in triumph, celebrating their capture. The iconography of elephants became associated with military power and exotic conquest throughout the Hellenistic world. The logistics of the campaigns reveal the enormous scale of ancient warfare. Moving tens of thousands of soldiers plus equipment and supplies required organization matching modern military operations. The supply lines supporting both armies stretched hundreds of miles. The food consumption alone was staggering, both armies together requiring hundreds of tons of food daily. The economic disruption in southern Italy where armies campaigned was severe and long-lasting. The human cost of the Pyrrhic Wars is difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest between 40,000 and 60,000 combatants died across all the battles. This figure doesn't include civilian casualties, deaths from disease and starvation in war zones, or the long-term demographic impact of losing so many young men. For comparison, this casualty count exceeded the total population of many ancient cities. The veterans of the Pyrrhic Wars carried physical and psychological scars for life. Ancient sources mention soldiers who never recovered from wounds received in the campaigns, who lived as invalids dependent on family or state support. The psychological trauma of combat, though not understood in modern medical terms, affected ancient soldiers as it does modern ones. Veterans' accounts describe nightmares, sudden panic at loud noises, and difficulty returning to civilian life. The social impact in Rome was profound. So many young men served in the legions fighting Pyrrhus that military service became a defining experience for an entire generation. The veterans formed a political constituency with shared interests and experiences. They expected rewards for their service, including land grants and political representation. The Senate's management of veteran affairs after the war set precedents for later Roman military colonies and veteran settlements. The war's conclusion marked the end of southern Italy's independence, but the beginning of its integration into the Roman system. Greek cities that had fought Rome now contributed to Roman military power. The Greek cultural influence on Rome accelerated, creating the Greco-Roman synthesis that would characterize Roman civilization. The soldiers who had fought as enemies became allies, with Greek soldiers and Italian tribesmen serving in Roman armies in subsequent conflicts. The military reputation Pyrrhus established lasted long after his death. Roman generals invoked his name when discussing tactical excellence. The comparison to Pyrrhus became shorthand for brilliant but strategically unsuccessful commanders. In later centuries, generals who won costly victories were said to have achieved Pyrrhic victories, a term that entered dozens of languages and remains in use today. The elephant handlers who served under Pyrrhus and survived the Italian campaigns returned home with incredible stories. Their accounts of fighting in Italy, of the battles and the Romans' determination, spread throughout the Hellenistic world. These stories influenced how other states viewed Rome, contributing to Rome's growing reputation as an unstoppable military power. The strategic transformation of the Mediterranean world accelerated after the Pyrrhic Wars. Rome's victory established it as the dominant power in Italy, setting the stage for conflict with Carthage. The First Punic War began less than a decade after Pyrrhus left Italy, as Rome and Carthage clashed over Sicily. The experience gained fighting Pyrrhus prepared Rome for the even longer, more costly struggle against Hannibal. The wars demonstrated that the future of Mediterranean warfare belonged to states that could mobilize massive resources rather than those relying on tactical sophistication. Professional armies commanded by brilliant generals would repeatedly lose to Rome's amateur citizen soldiers backed by superior logistics and unlimited manpower. This pattern would repeat in Rome's conquests of Macedonia, Greece, and eventually the entire Mediterranean basin. The Pyrrhic Wars mark the moment when Rome transitioned from Italian regional power to Mediterranean great power. The victory over Pyrrhus gave Rome confidence to challenge Carthage, the strongest naval power in the Mediterranean. The military reforms and strategic lessons from the wars provided tools Rome needed for Mediterranean conquest. The determination demonstrated in defeating Pyrrhus despite repeated tactical defeats became a defining characteristic of Roman strategic culture. For military historians, The Pyrrhic Wars remain a fascinating case study in asymmetric warfare and institutional adaptation. Pyrrhus possessed superior tactics, better trained soldiers, more sophisticated combined arms doctrine, and weapons Rome had never encountered. By conventional military analysis, he should have won decisively. Instead, Rome's strategic advantages, particularly unlimited manpower and willingness to accept casualties, proved decisive. The wars illustrate how military innovation doesn't always produce victory. Pyrrhus's use of elephants was innovative and initially devastating, but Rome's adaptive response neutralized the advantage. The lesson that innovation alone cannot guarantee success, that the enemy's response matters as much as the initial advantage, remains relevant in modern military theory. The Pyrrhic Wars also demonstrate the importance of strategic objectives versus tactical success. Pyrrhus won almost every battle, but failed to achieve strategic objectives. Rome lost most battles, but achieved its strategic goal of maintaining control over Italy. This distinction between tactical and strategic success is fundamental to understanding warfare, and the Pyrrhic Wars provide perhaps the clearest historical example. The story of war elephants terrifying Roman legions is ultimately a story about adaptation, resilience, and the limits of tactical brilliance. The Romans who fled in panic at Heraclea and the Romans who held their ground at Beneventum demonstrated humanity's capacity to overcome fear through experience and preparation. The institutional structures that allowed Rome to learn from defeat and return stronger proved more important than any weapon or tactic. The thunder of elephants that echoed across Italian battlefields between 280 and 275 BC gradually faded, replaced by the measured march of Roman legions. Pyrrhus departed Italy, having won his battles but lost his war. Rome remained stronger and more confident, ready to build an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. The elephants that had terrorized Roman soldiers became footnotes in history, remembered primarily for the famous defeats they inflicted but couldn't sustain. The legions they terrified became the foundation of the greatest military power the ancient world would know.